but this is going to be a great day of worship because our God promises to be where His people gather around Word and Sacrament. Pastor Eric, it's your time.
Nothing like a smooth transition, right? We'll see how smooth, yeah. So we are actually wrapping up our series called The Other Gods, where we have looked at the ways that the old pagan gods have kind of reinfected our culture, and that we have knowingly or unknowingly bowed down and worshiped them or tried to imbibe their essence. And so we are ending with a god that you probably haven't heard of, but you've at least heard the word, and that is Chronos. You hear that in chronology. And Chronos has a couple of different versions, but basically it deals with time. And he's not directly a god, he's a titan. And if you ever had to take classical mythology, you'll know what that means. And if you haven't, seriously, don't worry about it because it doesn't matter. But instead, thank you for laughing. Instead of talking about Chronos directly, we're going to jump right into the biblical text. And this book is a little bit different from the passages that we have looked at over the last 8 or so weeks that we have done this series. And it is the book of Ecclesiastes. How many here have read Ecclesiastes, just by show of hands? Okay, so a few of you. So the few of you that have read it know that Ecclesiastes is a really strange book. And it's a strange book in a lot of ways. And actually, the ancient rabbis, when talking about what books would and would not be included in the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, weren't so sure that they were going to include it. Now, eventually they did, but just by reading the book of Ecclesiastes, it doesn't take long for you to see, oh yeah, this is strange. And it's even so bizarre that we're not entirely sure what the title of the book means. In Hebrew, it's Koheleth. And Koheleth, as a word, as a noun, occurs only in the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, its root, kohal, occurs other places, and it means to assemble or assembly. So people guess that Koheleth means preacher. But we're not totally sure. So if we could go to the first verse, it says the words of the preacher. That would be Koheleth, probably means preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now traditionally we would say, oh, son of David, so that would mean Solomon. And Solomon is identified as the traditional author of Ecclesiastes. But there's a couple of problems with that even. The title Son of David can apply to a lot of people, basically anyone of the lineage of King David. Jesus would be considered a son of David, as the Messiah. And so we're not totally sure if that's what it means. And actually, I don't think it was written by Solomon, because in the book of Ecclesiastes, you find words that weren't really around until 500 years after he died. Now, it could have been edited, but I don't know. Now, if you're standing there, or sitting, actually, most of you are sitting, are thinking, why is he talking about this? I'm basically trying to induce some confusion. Because confusion is a really good way to approach the book of Ecclesiastes. And so he continues. He says, vanity of vanities, says Koheleth. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Now that's a classic Hebrew construction where you have the singular and then the plural. You may have heard this with holy of holies. And basically it's emphatic. It's like the biggest vanity imaginable. The most vain thing. So you could insert Kim Kardashian or something like that. The greatest of the vain things. And so immediately we're wondering, all right, what are you talking about here? because I'm pretty sure he wasn't thinking of Kim. He says, what does man gain, or woman, by the toil at which he toils under the sun? In other words, people work hard, and they struggle, and they slug through life, and they gain things. But then he's asking, what does he really gain for all the toil and the hard work, for all of the spreadsheets in your life, for all of the dirt to shovel and the concrete to pour and the marble to chisel and the affidavits to sign and the forms to fill out, and I'm just kind of tired thinking about it. So he asks, what's the point? And then he continues, and actually what follows for the next couple of verses is kind of his answer to that question, but we're going to see that Ecclesiastes, or the writer of, or Kohelet, asks all these questions and really doesn't answer any of them, which is kind of classically Jewish, as it were. So, in his answer, he says, in verse 4, there we go, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. And we think immediately, you're not answering the question. But in that classic Jewish way, you can answer a question either with a question or with a cryptic statement, because the point isn't the answer. The point is you wrestling with the answer. And in the sense that I don't want to just tell you the answer, because then the answer you have is my answer. I want the answer to be yours. And so he says, a generation goes, so basically he's saying you're going to die. Gee, thanks. Okay. And not only that, but he's talking about generations. He's saying that you are a tiny speck, a tiny grain of sand in a large beach of a generation. You are not significant, and you are going to go. And then the generation of grains of sand is going to arise after you. So in the whole self-esteem movement that you are a snowflake, unique and beautiful all to yourself, Ecclesiastes says you're going to die and you're not special. Again, thanks. But how is this an answer to the question of what man or woman gains under all the hard work that they do in their lives? Why is he saying you are going to die? So he continues. He says, the sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. There's a little bit of Hebrew cosmology there. They knew the sun kind of rose and set. They didn't know the earth was round, so they figured it kind of scurried underneath the foundations of the earth and then come back again. Yeah, thank you. I think it's kind of funny. And then he says, the wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind. And on its circuits, the wind returns. And that whole on its circuits thing, I remember as an undergrad trying to translate it. It's cryptic in English. It's worse in Hebrew. Actually, go back for a second. So he has the sun setting and rising, the winds blowing north and south, sun goes east to west, the winds go north and south. We have all the directions covered. Wait a minute. There's a completeness there, that in their circuits, in their cycles, we now have all four directions. He's hinting at something. Then he says in the next verse, all the streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they go again. Again, another circular thing, where you have all these great rivers. You have the Nile and the Congo and the Mississippi and the Colorado rivers, and they have tremendous amount of output, and they flow into the sea, and the sea is completely unchanged by it. A generation goes, and a generation comes. sun rises and the sun sets and the wind blows there and back again. And even the biggest rivers flow into the sea and make no impact. That's it. Huh. There's a connection here, but it's never, ever obvious with Ecclesiastes. He says, all things are full of weariness. Actually, go back for a second. I completely forgot something here. Actually, I forgot like a main section of the sermon. Awesome. In that completeness, that sun rising and setting, the streams flowing into the sea, and the sea is never changing. The winds blowing wherever they go. Entire generations die and entire generations are born. Does it matter if you're late to Little League? Absolutely not. A little while ago, I was in the Apple store getting something fixed or something or rather, and there was a kid, about 12, just kind of losing it. And I was amused at first, and then it was just frustrating because he, I don't know, for whatever reason, couldn't get the next iPhone, and so he was crying to his mom, I guess because she wouldn't buy it for him, and he was like, my life is ruined. Like, yeah, no, that will not be Nash. I mean, it's like deep breaths, Eric. He's not your kid. He's not your responsibility. But wow, really? Or my team didn't make the playoffs. Or the Giants lose. And yet the sun sets, the sun rises, the wind blows, and streams continue to flow in the ocean. I didn't get that promotion. My husband is angry with me. I'm late to a meeting. I lost my job. I can't afford the car that I really want. The stock market is kind of blowing to and fro like the wind. But the sun still rises and the sun still sets, and what does man gain under all this toil? Part of Koheleth's answer is found somewhere in those cycles. That maybe it's a matter of perspective. That when we take a step back and look at the broad picture, the big picture, this thing that we are worrying about is probably not very important. Now, there are a few exceptions. But let me ask you, what were you worrying about a year ago? Can you remember? My guess is if you can remember, it was probably a life or death situation. But at the time when you were worrying about it, how did it feel? It felt as big as the ocean. It felt like my life is ruined. And yet within that year, the sun kept rising, the sun kept setting, the winds blew, the waters flowed into the ocean, and life goes on. What does man gain when he toils with everything he does during his life? So now we go to the next verse. He says, all things are full of weariness. A man, or woman, obviously, cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Weariness. Who here is tired? I'm tired. I mean, part of it has to do with we have an almost 8-year-old who's teething. Or 8-month-old, there we go. Yeah, actually, there's one you don't know about. Yeah, wouldn't that be weird? Yeah. Ordination papers revoked. Anyway, yeah, 8-month-old who's teething and he's weary. But honestly, once he actually cuts those teeth, it's just going to be something else. You know? It's like you get through this big project at work, and it's finally over, and it's done, and you celebrate for a day, and then it's, boom, here's another stack. You've got another project. There is a weariness in the cycle of life. And Koheleth is very keen to remind us of this. That in the course of life, the things wear us out, and it doesn't matter what those things are. And then to put that in a different perspective, he says, the eye is never full of sinning. Have you ever watched a movie and said, this is it, I never have to watch a movie again, I am satisfied? Of course not. Or have you ever listened to a song, maybe the first time you heard Stairway to Heaven, a magical experience for just a masterpiece of a song. Have you ever said after that, I don't ever have to listen to a song again? I'm done. Great. You go to an art museum and you look at a work of art and you think, I never have to do this again. This is it. This is the definitive piece of art. Of course not. And we as Americans, and therefore consumers, are particularly struck by this. Or we have to constantly keep feeding our appetites. You never eat a meal and you say, I never have to eat again. You may say, I'm never eating again because you're stuffed. But there's no such thing as a definitive meal, or a definitive sunset, or a definitive piece of music. It just never satisfies. And in that process of trying to feed those desires, which is an enormously important theme for the book of Ecclesiastes, there develops this weariness. And the funny thing about Ecclesiastes is that as you read it, you find that it reads you as well. And as you work through this and you start to examine the ways that our appetites have just kind of run away with themselves, or how we've been kind of slaves to these deadlines and these projects and all of these cyclical things that occur in our lives. And then when we sit there and realize that the sun rises, the sun sets, waters flow, winds blow, it centers us a little bit. It actually evokes a change within us. And then he continues on. He says, what has been is what will be. And what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. A nice depressing twist to the end. But we in the Silicon Valley especially need to hear this, because we focus so much on the new, on developing these new technologies, and say, progress. I mean, we think that Twitter is this new, amazing, or terrible thing, depending on how you feel about Twitter. Wow, look at this technology. It enables all of this communication. We forget that the telegraph was like the same thing. This has already been done before. This is just a different medium. Or email. Wow, I can write things and then send them to other people. As though the art of letter writing never existed. They've been doing that for a long time. Or people complain that all this new technology is just developing a bunch of vapid, stupid bits of information, and nobody can write actually to each other anymore because they're just writing about stupid, dumb things and taking pictures of what they ate for dinner. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. And yet, when we examine a lot of older, even ancient writing, they're still talking about dumb, stupid, pointless, meaningless things. Nothing changes. Just the medium by which we do it. And it is at this point we reach the old pagan titan of Chronos, of time, where we worship, whether we realize it or not, the calendar, where we fill our calendar with things that we have to do, deadlines that we would like to meet, meetings and games, and we schedule things. We make arrangements, or we make an appointment to plan for things. That's like a meta meeting or something like that. It just doesn't fill us. If we were to take our smartphones, assuming a lot of you have them, and open up the calendar app and start going through, how many of those things are really going to be life and death matters? None of them, or very few of them. And yet, Chronos, that's my boy. And yet, Chronos sinks his claws into us and says, you must worship my calendar. You must fill your days and your weeks with things. And then he sacrifices both us and our families and friends as a result. I'm just as guilty of this. Please don't hear this as me saying I've figured this out. But Chronos demands that we fill our lives with stuff, with toil. And then at the end, what difference does it make? Because a generation goes, and then the next generation rises. Another way that he has kind of infected us is actually with being able to make predictions based on the year that it is. I heard this a lot at the bombing at the Boston Marathon, or as a result. People were saying, I can't believe this happens in 2013. As though people look at the calendar or at their computer and say, oh, it's 2013, I guess we can't bomb anybody anymore. Oh, it's, the 21st century, acts of violence are passé, so we're not going to do that anymore. As though we can say, aha, see, this is new. This is a new thing. We, as a human race, have progressed. And yet, Koheleth reminds us that people are still people. There's nothing new under the sun. And that just because it's 2013 doesn't mean that human nature has changed one bit. And Chronos continues to pull the strings as though we were marionettes dancing to our calendars and thinking, oh, we have developed something new. Now, the problem with Kohelet is that whenever you look at it or read it or examine it, it's kind of depressing. Because now we're stuck, right? It's like, well, I've filled my calendar. I've worshipped the date. I have not gained the perspective that the sun rises and sets without me Streams continue to flow into the ocean and the ocean is unchanged. And yet, what do I do about it? Now, practically speaking, it won't hurt you every once in a while, and it won't hurt me to say, well, do I really need to fill my calendar with all these things? Am I pushing myself too hard? Am I trying to reach for that prize of success that is defined as always being just too far away? Am I sacrificing my family, my friends, my relationship? It is helpful to ask yourselves those questions with the perspective that the sun's still going to rise and set, the wind is still going to blow, and the rivers are going to continue to flow into the sea. Now, Jesus said, I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am in the beginning, and I am the end. John, in the book of John and his other book, Revelation, begins with describing Jesus as the Word that was spoken to create the universe. And then it ends with Jesus taking his throne in the renewed earth, in the new city. And it begins and ends with Jesus. Which means that ultimately it's not about, okay, I've got to do this, and this, and then I'm going to be okay. I've got to remove my all this fluff from my calendar that doesn't matter. I have to get a better perspective. Check. I've got to, make an appointment on my calendar to do these things, which is a meta problem or something like that. And therefore, I'm going to be good. That's going to help. I really recommend it. And I know saying this, Katie is going to say, all right, practice what you preach. But realize the even broader perspective. That with the sun rising and the sun setting, all things have come into existence because Jesus was the Word that God spoke to create the universe. And as we've looked at these different gods and these different essences that are tearing us apart in our culture, that Jesus is not only the individual answer because he's bigger, better, and stronger than all of these other gods. If that was the point, then what we're really worshiping is biggerness, betterness, and strength. But in these essences, and in our calendars, and in the gods of Aphrodite and Zeus and Poseidon that have sunk its claws into our culture, when we take a step back, we know that Jesus has taken the throne, that all things are subject to him, and that we look to the resurrection of the body and the day that everything and everybody will finally acknowledge what has long since been true, and that is Jesus is Lord of all. He is Lord over time. He is Lord over our calendars. He is the Lord of sex and strength and power. He is Lord over fear and ultimately Lord over death. As we wrap this series up, which has been a lot of fun to preach, I hope that it's been helpful for y'all. Know that when we say Jesus is Lord, it is not a trite, simplistic saying that, oh, yeah, Jesus is cool. But rather that all creation has and will bow its knee, acknowledging that through all things and in all things, Jesus reigns. And if he reigns in your life, if you have been baptized into God's kingdom, know that for all of the ways that we have bowed down and worshiped all of these gods, all of these things that destroy us, that dehumanize us, that tear us apart, and all the ways that we've filled our calendars and worshiped our calendar and worshiped deadlines and thought that they were going to give us everything we hoped that we or think we need, that Jesus is still Lord and you are forgiven. Amen.